Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I'm your host, Zach Bitter, and today I have a guest interview for you. Today's guest is Stuart Chutter. Stuart is a very interesting person. He actually reached out to me after I did a podcast on kind of health influencers getting into the regenerative farming movement. And Stuart was an easy invite for me because he has a lot of interesting topics about his lifestyle that I wanted to hear more about. And one of he is an ultramarathon runner, or I guess regular runner, if you want to call it that. He does marathons and things shorter than ultras as well, too. And also obstacle course racing type stuff. So he has a really cool setup up in Canada where he decided about 6 years ago to build out a regenerative farm and make his living that way. And within that framework, he has built like an outdoor gym with like a squat rack and stuff outside, as well as in a couple of instances, done some pretty cool, what I would call like personal projects. One of which he trained for a marathon and raced the marathon, eating nothing than what he grew or raised on his specific farm. And he's also done some similar things in the past too, where he did that with just like kind of like local farms around him, where he was using some products outside his farm, but they were all kind of neighboring farms around his area. So I want to kind of hear about his lifestyle, what got him into regenerative farming, what his draw was to running, how that all kind of impacts the way he trains and goes about his lifestyle, and just learn a little bit more about some of this regenerative farming technique and where he kind of views it going, where he views farms that are either like moving towards that versus taking a more traditional model and all sorts of that stuff. So that's today's interview. Also, as always, if you want to access these episodes ad-free and early release, that option is available to you on the show Patreon page. You can link over to the show Patreon page by just heading to the Human Performance Outliers podcast website, which is just zachbitter.com/HPO. There you'll find links to the show Patreon page, donation options, as well as details, discounts, and things that are offered from individual episodes as well. If you're curious about what's up there right now I have, from yet to be released standpoint, is Boyd Myers is up there. Boyd is what I would call maybe a non-traditional endurance athlete. He actually had a background in bodybuilding and as a service member. So he owned a gym, ended up selling it, ended up gaining a bunch of weight, and decided he needed to get things back in line and picked up running. If I remember correctly, I believe it was over the pandemic. And now is just doing all sorts of crazy adventures and things like that. He just decided to randomly run 100 miles one day. He's currently signed up for a back-to-back Ironman, half Ironman in what'll be a couple of weeks, I think. And he's doing that with the Gold Star Initiative, where he'll carry a flag for the running portion of both of those races and then present it to one of the Gold Star families at the finish line. So had a fun chat with him and find out kind of what gets him ticking and interested in endurance sport, triathlon, and all these other things that he's up to. Very charismatic guy. So it was fun to hear the spontaneity that he puts into his training and his day-to-day life. Also, for those of you interested in working with me, either one-on-one or just following along with my coaching philosophy, I do have some ready-made coaching plans as well as one-on-one coaching packages available on my website at zachbitter.com. There you can access that, reach out to me, and find out if it's going to be a good fit for you. If interested, over on my website at zachbitter.com, you can also subscribe to my newsletter, which I don't send out super frequently, but when I do have a topic I want to do written, I'll usually send that out. So if you're interested in kind of getting those updates every once in a while, feel free to head over there and subscribe to that newsletter. Also, if you want to support the podcast in a way that is non-monetarily based, you can do that by liking, subscribing, and sharing the podcast on your favorite listening platforms on social media. Let your friends, your family members know if you find an episode that you like and you'd like them to hear it. That helps me grow the podcast and spend more time doing it. So if that's something you can do, that'd be great. Otherwise, the final option for us today before we head into this interview is the show sponsors. If one of the show sponsors has a product that you find would be useful for your life and you want to try out, you can access their discounts and links through this show and let them know that you came through them. Those are all at zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors. Today's sponsors include Bond Charge and Optimal Carnivore. Bond Charge is a holistic wellness brand with a range of products that help you navigate the modern environment in a better way. They focus on things like circadian rhythm and optimal sleep routines. I've been using 2 of their products this summer. These include their 100% blackout sleep masks and their blue light blocking glasses. Good sleep hygiene like a cool temperature environment, pitch black darkness, and a quiet environment can go a long way to help you stay asleep and maximize your nighttime rest. So personally, I like a consistent routine I can replicate whether I am at home or traveling. Being able to replicate my routine as close as possible makes it easier to consistently get a good night's sleep, regardless of whether I am home or traveling. I use the Bond Charge sleep mask to make sure I have the same 100% blackout regardless if I am at home or traveling. The material on the Bond Charge sleep mask is comfortable, adjustable, and allows me to sleep on my back or sides without discomfort. The soft padded eye cups allow you to open your eyes while wearing the mask. I also spend a lot of time every day staring at computer screens, phones, and tablets while recording, editing podcasts, answering emails, and writing my coaching plans. I use the Bond Charge blue light blocking glasses while trying to stay an arm's width away from the screen when possible and refocusing my eyesight every 20 minutes. This helps minimize discomfort from blue light and glare from staring at screens all day. If you want to check out either of these products and the rest of the things that Bond Charge has on their website, you can go to bondcharge.com/HPO and use coupon code HPO to save 20% off your order. That's BONCHARGE.com/HPO and use coupon code HPO to save 20% off your order. Bond Charge ships worldwide in rapid time and has easy return and exchanges if you are not satisfied. Organ meats are some of the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. Despite their benefits, sometimes it can be difficult to incorporate them into your diet. Optimal Carnivore aims at making these nutrients easier to access with their products, which include grass-fed organ complex, bone marrow complex, and grass-fed beef liver. These products work great for busy people who are traveling or as they develop an appreciation for organ meats. Their grass-fed organ complex has 9 different organs, including beef liver, brain, thymus, heart, kidney, spleen, pancreas, lung, and gallbladder. Bone marrow complex contains the same components as bone broth. Their products are 100% grass-fed and grass-finished and free of hormones, pesticides, antibiotics, and GMOs. They also plant 1 tree for every product sold. If interested, you can visit amazon.com/optimal carnivore and use the code HUMANSAVE10, that's HUMANSAVE10, for 10% off your next order. As always, all HPO sponsors, links, discounts can be found by visiting the show sponsor page at zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors.
The 5 principles of soil health that guide decisions on my farm are planting diversity, keeping my soil covered, minimizing disturbance of the soil, keeping a plant growing as long in the season as possible, and incorporating livestock integration and animal impact into nutrient cycles.
I'm really excited to talk to you, Stuart, because you had been listening to the podcast, and I just recently, for the first time in a while, actually had an episode where it touched on or dove into like regenerative agriculture. And one of the reasons I went back towards that from some of the previous episodes that I've done with it that were a little more exclusively regenerative agriculture was because something has started to occur that I was really curious about when I spoke to like the Alan Savorys and the Bobby Gills of the world, who were kind of, I would call, more into that process before people were really aware of it, or they were kind of some guys that maybe like thrust it into the public eye, so to speak. And a lot of them all kind of mentioned that a big catalyst that would come with growth within regenerative agriculture would be people from other areas, maybe even outside of agriculture, coming into it and then getting some people that are recognizable, have a big signal boost, being able to kind of promote it. So when I had Jana and Evan on, that was kind of them. It was like, these are two people who have been big in the fitness industry and different areas of business and things like that, that decided they wanted to get in on it. And they were maybe a little more on, I think, the processing kind of like end product side of things. So when you reached out to me and told me that you are an ultramarathon runner, someone who converted their farm to a regenerative farm, and if I remember correctly, you even trained and raced an ultramarathon eating nothing but the food you grew on your regenerative farm, uh, we had to talk. So thanks a bunch for taking some time and coming on the show.
You bet. Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed a lot of your podcasts, especially those regenerative ones you mentioned. But yeah, that recent one really caught my attention. As a regenerative farmer, I'm a huge believer that healthy soil makes healthy food, and that makes healthy people. And I we talk about that a lot in farming, in regenerative agriculture. So it was so fascinating to me to see people outside of farming who are so influential in the health space key into that as well, and really, really getting excited about healthy soil, because that's such a passion of mine.
Yeah. Had you always been a farmer, or was that a family trade, or was it something you got into later in life?
Yeah, a bit of both. I grew up on a beef cattle ranch in BC in Western Canada. So I grew up in agriculture, but I believed growing up, to be a farmer, you either had to inherit it or be independently wealthy. People don't just start their own farms. But after university, I went out and I worked in commercial finance in agriculture. So was looking after loans as an account manager to farmers and ranchers in Alberta at the time. And as their banker, you really get to ask probing questions and ask questions about their story that you wouldn't otherwise be able to ask as an outside person. And that really opened my mind that farmers and ranchers, a lot of them are multi-generational, but somewhere down the line was somebody who just started, who that was their dream, that was their passion. They were willing to bet on themselves, take a big risk. So yeah, 2 years into that job, I quit my job and rented a farm and started building a herd of livestock. So I call my farm a first generation farm, and I've owned it for 6 years now. I run a herd of about 200 purebred red Angus cattle, and I'd call myself a regenerative farmer. I'm very grass-based, very low input in my management. And the 5 principles of soil health they really guide every decision I make on my farm. They've almost become the 5 principles of life for me, not just soil life, but yeah, regenerative agriculture really has become a deep passion. I didn't grow up in that space, like where I grew up, and most of agriculture that I was exposed to early in my career was conventional agriculture, the way it has always been done. But I think that's the freedom that being a first generation farm allows me, is there is no way that it's always been done. Everything I do on my farm is just has just been from beginning. So it's a decision I get to make based on what I see, what I know, what I learn, and I get to experiment and try things. And so sometimes I complain that being a first generation farm is hard, but it really does allow a lot of freedom as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when I just imagine like that scenario occurring, even just outside the regenerative agriculture world, it seems like a very, very steep hill to climb, and then one that maybe doesn't even offer a clear reward. And when I think a person looks at it practically, I could totally see, especially when you're the age you're going to just decide what you want to do with your life. You're like in your late teens, early 20s, going to university or doing whatever, is like deciding like, hey, I'm gonna like get into farming. If you're not actually on a farm growing up, the likelihood of that decision being made, I think, is just so low. And then on top of it, when you look at opportunity cost between that and something that's maybe a little more predictable, it's just like, it's no surprise to me that we're not seeing like tons of first generation farmers getting into the conventional model. Because from what I understand, the conventional model sort of locks you in to the point where you're, by the time you get started and get all the stuff you need to actually run a farm, you're like pretty much working your way out of debt for a huge portion of that, and then having really tight margins and one bad season away from things really getting dicey. And I just wonder like where the risk reward ratio is there for most people. Is it, first of all, I should ask, am I even on the right track with that line of thinking? And if I am, is regenerative agriculture also potentially a better path forward for someone wanting to get in as a first generation farmer in terms of maybe mitigating some of that?
Yes and no. I mean, the barriers to entry of agriculture are huge, no matter what type of farming. It doesn't matter what commodity you're growing, whether it's grain crops or livestock or dairy production. There's huge barriers, no matter what industry, but also no matter your production practices. I don't think regenerative agriculture overcomes all that, but yeah, I think there's elements of it that do make that easier. I do think that's a part of how I ended up in the regenerative area. When I bought my farm, I didn't know much about soil health in hindsight. Even when I started farming, I look back and I think, I only did that out of naivety and youthful excitement and having big dreams. But yeah, I fell into regenerative agriculture largely because the farm I bought had such poor soil, and I didn't really recognize that until after I was operating it. And I had to come up with a plan of how to operate profitably on poor soil that needed to be rebuilt or regenerated. And I needed to do that on a budget of a startup farm where inputs and equipment were not an option. And that's where I think when I started livestock production, I thought farming was looking after livestock. And I love cows. They're my passion. I love spending time with my cows. But slowly I learned that to be a good livestock producer, you need to have good, healthy grass. And to grow good grass, you need good, healthy soil. And so slowly my paradigm shifted from my job was to look after livestock to now my job is to look after my soil. And I spend way less time looking after my livestock or paying attention to my livestock, because when I'm focusing on the soil, that happens more naturally. And now I find myself, it's the soil that gets me excited. The cows are the business. The cows are how I harvest and make a revenue source, but it's the soil that I'm focused on and that I'm building, and that is making a profitable farm for me. And so, yeah, I think as a first generation farm, going back to your question, it is regenerative practices that have made it work for me. So many of the decisions have been about building production systems and nutrient cycles in a very low cost way, so that the margins of food production, there's still profit left over for my farm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you first realized, all right, I've got some bad soil on my hands here, and this is going to have to be something I solve before I can really get too far down the line, or I'll be running into issues down the road. What is the timeline like that from the point where you realize I've got poor soil quality? Is that like a multi-season process of getting it back to where you want it? Or is that something that once you recognize it and know the right path forward, it can turn over pretty quickly?
Yeah, no, it's been a process. And this is where I draw so many parallels between regenerative agriculture and running or a training plan. Same with running a marathon or running an ultra. That's not something you just do. You don't just wake up tomorrow and you're an ultra marathoner, or wake up and go run 100 miles. And I think it's the same of regenerative farming. You don't just turn off the fertilizer and change all your practices overnight. That is a process. On my farm, it took me 5 years before I completed my first year with no fertilizer, no chemical use, and just nutrient cycling using regenerative ag practices. And the same, it took me 3 years of running before I signed up for my first ultra. So it's a long, long process. It's like training for a run. And it's not something that or at least in my story, it's not something I did everything all at once in 1 year. It was picking a practice change that would be most significant for my farm, something I could cash flow in a year, something that I really needed to prioritize in that year, in the same way you might pick an element of running to train in a season, whether it's speed work or mobility or some injury you're trying to deal with. It was picking one thing at a time. So for me, I started with cover crops and no-till practices. Prior to me buying the farm, the soil was fully tilled, very low fertility applied, no animal impact, and very poor, low organic matter. So I incorporated cover crops right away and livestock grazing right away. And those were the two practices that really accelerated the growth of my soil in the first 2 years. And when I bought my farm, the soil was about 2.1% organic matter. And in 3 years, that had more than doubled to 4.9%. So those two practices alone were the priorities on my farm. And even still, every year I'm adding something new. I'm experimenting with earthworms right now and really loving that. All of my land now is seeded to perennial grasses and legumes. So focused on fixing nitrogen right out of the atmosphere without any synthetic nitrogen use, and keeping a living root photosynthesizing in the ground as long in the season as possible, so that microbials in the soil are being fed root exudates from plants all year, or not all year, but as long in the growing season that we have up here in Canada. So those are the priorities right now. And yeah, I think it is like running. You're always setting a new goal, always looking for a longer distance to challenge yourself, or a faster pace, or what's the next thing for next season. And it's the same for me at least, it's the same on my farm of what's the next thing to refine, what's the next practice. Because that's the beautiful thing about regenerative agriculture, is it's not just a practice or a things you tick off that you're doing on your farm. It really is a mindset of how you approach things, how you think, solutions you're trying to find, and improvements you're trying to make. And I think that's why I see so many parallels between being a regenerative farmer and being an athlete, is they are both so mindset driven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a clear parallel the way you describe it. The way I think about it with the running side of things is, yeah, obviously that's where I know anything comparatively. But yeah, it is like one of those things. Like, I mean, even where I'm at in my running career, where like I know I can finish 100 miles, and I can even predict fairly accurately as to like when I'll finish, if I'm having a decent day, or a really good day, or however well I kind of execute things. But with that, like when I pick a race, for 6 months out, and I've talked about this a few times on this podcast, is just like, if I'm thinking about that end product of crossing that finish line at whatever goal it is, from day one all the way there, like that can be part of my motivation. But if that's all my motivation, there's going to be some incredible low points relative to where I want my motivation to be in order to execute workouts properly. So you kind of have to scale it back once you know what you want to do and look like, okay, what's the path forward here? Now I have like that scaffolding in place. But once I have that in place, I have to make sure I'm doing things in the right order of operations in order to get to that end goal. And that might mean really narrowly focusing on what's this first task. Let's make sure this one gets done right before I even think about the second task. And what you described is kind of just like that. So I would imagine there was some carryover there. Did I guess this is kind of the chicken or egg question. Did the ultra running come first, or was regenerative agriculture something that you took on before you got into ultra running?
Yeah, no, I was deep down regenerative agriculture before ultra running, before running at all. Uh, yeah, I started running about 3.5 years ago. It was a point when life really sucked. The farming that year was a disaster. I was having animal health problems. Um, so I set out running just as stress relief. I didn't even plan to actually start running. Just one day I woke up and felt I needed to get some stress out of my body, and just went for a run and ran around my farm. My farm's 640 acres, so that's a mile by a mile. So I ran 4 miles, and I thought that was just the longest distance ever. And it felt so good. I've kept going since then. And yeah, like you say, running and regenerative agriculture, there's so many parallels. Maybe that's why I stuck with it. Um, slowly seeing how far I could go, wanting to go further. And then having the endurance athlete in me was born just running around the farm. And now both are such big parts of my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to think because I started running early enough in my life where a lot of my life lessons came from running as like teaching me that kind of way to approach different tasks. And it sounds like for you, it was almost like you kind of used your life experiences, at least with regenerative agriculture, to kind of move into running and use those same principles to get to where you wanted to be on that side of things as well.
I think so. I think regenerative agriculture really has become a value-based part of my life in terms of contributions to the environment, sequestering carbon, animal welfare, soil conservation. Those are all things that are important to me that I can provide or give in life. And I think running is interesting to me because it does the opposite. It provides so much to me in terms of confidence, community, my capability. I think regenerative agriculture is a place I can give, and running is a place that fuels me to keep going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing I think is just like how you spread your energies out here. Cause I'm thinking of just like a day in the life of Stuart and what that maybe entails, especially when you're kind of in the thick of it training for a race. You've got to be like being active on top of active, I would imagine. I mean, I grew up in the Midwest and actually worked on a couple of farms periodically while I was younger. So I have a general idea of just the physicality of such a occupation. But maybe why don't you walk us through what is a day kind of, if there's any similarities? I realize there can be a lot of differences from one day to the next, but generally speaking, is there kind of a routine you have for your day in terms of how you manage your energies and kind of position everything from training to actually getting done the work you want to get done for the day on the farm?
Not really. It is very seasonal based. Yeah, and every day is different. I think farming is very active life, and that probably made transitioning into running a lot easier because I did have at least a base of movement and time on my feet that running provides. I'm also really into Spartan races. I'm just in love with them, and some of those obstacles like farmer carries,
Yeah.
sandbag carries, They're the easiest for me. Every time I do a sandbag carry at a Spartan race, I just feel like I'm putting out mineral or salt to the cows, and that's just easy. I don't need to train that. That's just a daily routine. So um, yeah, like right now I'm training for the Spartan Ultra World Championships on September 25th. So that's a 24-hour race down in Lake Tahoe. So I am just trying to get as much time on my feet as possible, whether that's chores on the farm. I try and get in about 10 miles a day of running. I try and prioritize compound lifting. So on my farm, just in front of the barn, I have a squat rack and kettlebells and tires to flip. In the barn, I have rafters that I can use. They're not like monkey bars, but I can hang from them and train grip strength for obstacles. So the farm's been pretty cool for obstacle training in terms of looking around and seeing what do I have that I can train for obstacles, because I don't have access to gyms or ninja gyms or Spartan specific obstacles when I'm not in the city.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I've baled hay before. I can imagine that gets you quite a ways of the way there. In fact, I remember when I was really young, the first time I ever baled hay, I went, this was like the middle of July in the Midwest. So I'm just like, well, I'm definitely wearing shorts. And I walk in there, and my buddy who had done it a few times, he's just laughing at me. He's like, dude, you are going to regret wearing shorts at the end of this day. It's
totally.
like the straw is not soft.
Totally. But you know what? Actually, you say that, and that's an interesting thing about regenerative agriculture, is because the focus is so much working with nature and nature systems, that a lot of those jobs are disappearing on my farm. Now the grazing season is so much longer, as plants are so much more productive. I'm bale grazing as opposed to putting out hay every year or every day. So there's so many elements of farm work that have gotten easier as I rely on nature as opposed to management. So I do find I'm actually putting in more training, because farm work has gotten easier over the past few years, and now I both have the time to train and also more the need to train, because I'm not throwing around bales all day or doing as much manual work. So I've never really thought of it like that, but that is an outcome of regenerative agriculture, is working with nature systems does simplify things. And that's been such a great benefit or process on my farm over the last 5 years, where as a relatively young farmer before, I was just working so hard. I was married to the farm. To make it work, that consumed all of my life. Whereas now with regenerative agriculture practices, I do have the freedom to pursue other passions, spend time elsewhere, go to these ultra events. That didn't happen 5 years ago, and it couldn't have happened 5 years ago because I didn't have the time or the freedom.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I suppose that's another huge barrier to entry for someone who would want to get into farming too, is you just look at it comparatively to kind of a typical like work scenario where, I mean, and we're coming off a Labor Day weekend here in the United States. It's like, that's like a day that was put in place specifically so workers could say, all right, we get an extra day to catch our breath and, enjoy some outdoor time or do whatever it is you want to do outside of work. But if you're a farmer, it doesn't matter if it's Labor Day, if there's, cows to be milked or something needs to get done on the farm, you're going to do that. And, you might have a farm hand or something that's going to take over for time to time and stuff like that. But it's interesting to hear that with once you kind of get your system in place, it makes sense. You're not fighting nature to the degree you would by trying to implement a structure that is foreign to that area, where you have to kind of turn it into something it's not, or keep it something it was by doing things to the soil and the land to kind of try to preserve it, since what you're doing to it is so destructive, I guess, right?
Yeah. I think building the soil, building systems, working with nature, that's given me that freedom and more time. It's also, I have been able to find more help on the farm because it's not as hard. It's easier to get help when the work is not as manual, not as hard. And also the people that I work with on my farm now, it's actually been pretty cool how regenerative agriculture has brought fascinating, amazing people into my life who want to be on the farm, who want to be a part of that process with me, who share values, who are just interesting, fascinating, great people to be around. Anyways, so yeah, regenerative agriculture has made it easier, both the amount of work, but also the help to get work done and attracting people that I want in my life. So it's been a great community builder for me. And that's why I can also go out and run now and do these races, do these events, and pursue some other interests in life too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it makes sense. And one topic I really wanted to kind of dive into you with around regenerative agriculture is sort of this. I mean, this is like anything nowadays, right? Like we seem to want to put things in an easy to understand black and white type of categorization where it's like it's either this or that, and you have to pick the one. And then once you pick the one, you're all in on it, regardless of whether it's hypocritical or not. And you're kind of stuck there. You're stuck there potentially defending things you wouldn't defend because it's within the category that you chose. And you were talking to me a little bit online about just like how there is like probably a need or an understanding that I'm sure I haven't touched on in great detail with my previous regenerative agriculture episodes, which is just this like idea of a middle ground or a like a starting point for people, because like you're just not going to turn, like you mentioned, a conventional farm or no farm into a regenerative farm overnight. So what is it, or maybe I should ask it like this: is there things that you're seeing in place that are kind of making that door open a little slower for farmers if they want to get interested in it, where they can say like, all right, I'm going to take this step this year but still be able to maintain everything that I was doing before, and kind of start out with like kind of a partial or a hybrid model of of regenerative agriculture, and then kind of see where that goes? Like, where are the opportunities within that kind of a system?
Yeah, exactly. I'm so glad you brought that up. I do think the regenerative movement or the regenerative community has a massive problem in, I don't know if it's ego or whether it's just, the world we live in where everything is polarized and you're either regenerative and great or conventional and bad. And I don't believe that at all. I think regenerative is a process, and so many farmers, even whether they'd call themselves regenerative or not, are still doing amazing things. I know up here in Canada, over 60% of our farmland is in no-till seeding practices. So that's one of the key fundamental pillars of soil health, and the bulk of farmland already has that implemented. Same with planting diversity. One of the other 5 principles of soil health. Up here in Saskatchewan, we grow wheat, barley, oats, a lot of oil seeds, canola, mustard, flax. We're the biggest exporter of lentils in the world. We also grow peas and some chickpeas and beans. So it's not intercropping and it's not diversity within the field every year, but we have great farmers with fantastic crop rotations, even in the conventional world. So I'm not at all a believer that regenerative is perfection and conventional is horrific. I think the bulk of conventional farmers are down a regenerative journey, even if they might not say it. In the same way that in the running world, if you run, you're a runner. Whether you're running an ultramarathon and doing everything to maximum degree, or whether you're entering your first 5K race. And I think that's the same with farming. If you are farming with a mindset of improving your soil, being there for the long run, making benefits to the environment, which I think are pretty fundamental belief systems in the farm community. If I look out at my neighbors and my farm neighbors, even those farming conventionally, they are implementing practices with those values in mind. Not to the degree that Joel Salatin or Will Harris is doing, but um, they are making changes and improvements on an annual basis. And I see that all the time, whether it's fertilizer efficiency, whether it's experimenting with cover crops. Just the other day, I was out for a run, and one of my neighbors had put up a new on-farm weather station. So this is a weather station you put right on the ground. It has a soil probe that'll measure soil moisture, wind speed, precipitation, and it'll has logarithms in place to calculate your yield potential based on weather, what's happening in the weather. And that can tell you exactly how much fertilizer to put down to grow the optimal crop without wasting or overusing any fertilizer, if there's moisture limitations. And so from a nitrogen management perspective, that's fantastic. And that neighbor would not at all call themselves regenerative, but what an amazing investment to make for soil health and for the environment. So I see that in farming in general, that regenerative practices are being more and more implemented, whether we call them that or not. And I think the regenerative movement would be far more successful, far more influential if we champion that every small step, every change, instead of vilifying conventional agriculture. Because at least in Canada, I'm so proud to eat Canadian food. Our Canadian farmers do so much good for the environment. So to vilify that, I think is just not true and is sensational. Yes, I want to encourage them to keep going. Yes, I'd love to see more intercrop and more of the 5 principles of soil health implemented wider across acreage in Canada. But that's not going to happen from polarizing regenerative agriculture and conventional agriculture. Just like anything, it comes from cheering people on. I mean, an ultra runner becomes an ultra runner over years of training, and they probably started with a 10K or a half marathon, and people cheered them on, and they fell in love with the sport, and they saw results, and they saw improvements, and they just kept going. And I think that's how you keep going in the regenerative world. I mean, for me, when I started soil testing and seeing improvements in my organic matter, that's what really, really got me hooked on regenerative agriculture, both because I knew the benefits for profitability and production in terms of water holding capacity, nutrient management that organic matter offered. But also I finally had numbers to show how much carbon was being sequestered in my soil and what a benefit that beef production is to the environment. And that's something I really believe. And my carbon soil test showed me that. And that's when I really went further and further down into the regenerative world. So in terms of influencing the farm community, that's where that's kind of the mindset I am, that I would rather cheer them along, and share my successes and share their successes, because whether they call themselves regenerative or conventional, they're making great contributions.
Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this episode is brought to you by Bond Charge and Optimal Carnivore. if you are interested in checking out the details and links to these show sponsors, you can head to zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors. Yeah, there's some excellent points in there. I think, like, especially along the ag tech side of things, I mean, which you mentioned, it's just like you have more resources now to be able to validate the work you're putting in the terms of like seeing that progress enough to kind of say, okay, I'm heading in the right direction. Let's stay the course and I'll continue to see this progress. And then also, their neighboring farms. I mean, Joel Salatin talked about that when he first started his, like he turned what was otherwise like abandoned farmland essentially into, where he has Polyface Farm now. And like, it was just, the proof was in the pudding. Like his neighbors saw that, were like, well, we want that. So, and then you mentioned the 5 pillars and stuff like that. I would imagine that, you don't have to sell them on all 5 pillars right out the gate, like, but maybe they latch themselves to one of them and say, hey, this is kind of interesting. I think I could benefit from that. And they try it. And then when that works, they get interested in a second or third pillar. And before you know it, they're looking at all 5 and interested in it. And you don't have to force it down their throat. They just, naturally kind of come at their own pace to some degree. It sounds like that's your approach mostly.
Yeah, exactly. Both from the producer farmer perspective, but also the consumer perspective as well. I found sharing my story, sharing benefits, showing what I'm doing. I've been able to have some really great discussions with my farm neighbors, but also some really great discussions with urban consumers about farming. I mean, on the farm end, I remember when I moved to the farm, one of my neighbors who I didn't know at that time, he came over, and a real like loud, abrasive guy. And he says, "Oh, I hear you're this hippie farmer planting all these like mixed crops and flowers. And I just wanted to come over and see." And I didn't know him at the time. I thought he was kind of being a jerk. So I pointed him out to where my field was, and he went and had a look. And 2 years later, he came over and he's like, "Wow, I can really see the difference in your production, and your cows look in great shape." And then the following year, he asked me, "Where did you get your seed for that polycrop?" And just last year, he sent me a video of his cows out on his land grazing sunflowers and radishes and warm season grasses and cool season grasses, and this diverse mix of soil building feed crops. And he was just blown away at the condition of his cows and how long into winter they could graze. And I thought that was a pretty cool transition of a neighbor showing up, kind of making fun of me, to a neighbor seeing it work and implementing it on his farm. And then on the consumer end, kind of similar stories as well. I mean, I've been spending more and more time in the city now, both just for social life, but also for running. And so often I get asked or told by people I meet here, I don't think they're meaning to be rude, but they kind of ask me like, aren't you bad you're a beef producer? Aren't you like an environmental evil? Like, you and your cows, you're just horrible. And I can show them soil carbon tests that validate that by grazing cattle, I am putting more carbon into the soil than the cows emit through methane. And that's, Will Harris makes that same claim, and it's been audited by General Mills or verified by General Mills. And I have that same data on my farm showing that by rotationally and intensively grazing cattle, I can keep plants photosynthesizing longer in the season. And cows are a system that are net carbon sequesterers. And so we so often blame them for emissions, but if we look at the system as a whole, there's more carbon going into the ground. And I love telling that story because I think when people stop and think about it, it is relatively easy to understand. In terms of photosynthesis, plants are breathing in CO2 and putting out O2. So taking in carbon dioxide and putting out oxygen, and that carbon is going down into the soil through their roots. And if grass does that in the growing season, it's going to photosynthesize and put carbon down in the ground. And then it's going to go to seed and go reproductive, and it's going to stop photosynthesizing and focus on putting out seed. But if just before that time, a great big herd of cows comes and takes bites out of that grass, then that plant has to photosynthesize and photosynthesize again and put more carbon into the ground. And if you manage those cows so that they're doing that 2, 3, 4 times in the season, instead of that grass just going through its life cycle photosynthesizing once in the growing season, now it's doing it 3 or 4 times and putting 3 or 4 times as much carbon down into the ground. And that's how cows, when managed properly, can ensure that carbon is being put in the ground at levels beyond the emissions that they have. And so good managed cows are net carbon sequesters.
That's really interesting. I think that was the easiest for a layperson like myself to understand the whole process with the way you described it, where it's not just kind of that one cycle of carbon sequestration with the cows. That piece to the puzzle allows you to 3-4 times that process in what would normally just be one. Is a really kind of awesome way to look at it or think about it, I think. And just like thinking about the whole thing too, one of the questions I kind of wanted to ask about that, I had a rancher on a while back, and I'm blanking on which one it was, but he was talking about this system where, like you mentioned, you have tons of different types of plants out there that the cows are grazing on, versus like a very select few or mono situation where they're eating the same thing over and over. And he had his setup was that they were grazing on, like, I think it was upwards to like 1,000 different species of grass over the course of the year. And I don't know like what that does for the cow. I would imagine a more diverse diet like that is going to be better for the cow. I don't know, maybe it's not giving a higher quality output from a meat standpoint, but it certainly, I would imagine, is better for the cow's health and ability to thrive while it's alive, if I'm guessing right. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know of any data that would support cow health on grazing a mixed species crop, but I certainly believe that. Planting diversity is one of the 5 principles of soil health. So sometimes it's not necessarily about what the cow is eating, but it's feeding your soil microbes. So if you have a highly diverse blend of forages and feeds, each one of those plant species has a purpose. So for example, you might have a warm season grass and a cool season grass in the blend. And one of those is going to grow more in the spring and one is going to take off in the summer. You likely want to have a legume species like peas and clover in your blend. And those will pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fixate it into the soil. And that nitrogen will feed the other crops in your blend, like those grasses. You might want to have a tuber crop like turnips in the blend, and that'll help with soil compaction and breaking up your soil. You probably want to have a deep taproot like sunflower in your blend, and that'll, again, scavenge for nutrients deeper in the soil and bring them up to the surface. It can also help bring up water from deeper in the soil during drought years. So for me, yes, I do think those diverse plant crops are good for cattle health and a good nutrient profile for their growth and production and health. But like I said earlier, I'm more and more focused on the soil. And I think feeding the soil is the most important. So when you have that diversity of plants, they are sending all different types of root exudates down into the soil so that all of your microbials in the soil are getting fed well, and they're building the soil health, they're building organic matter, and that's growing better feed for your cattle no matter what the species, which is leading to good production and profit on the farm. And I think that was a hugely important realization for me, that building soil organic matter isn't just about plant organic matter in terms of decaying plants on the surface or manure from cattle, but it's about that life cycle of all of those microbials in your soil. Because the more you have of them living and growing and dying in your soil, their dead bodies are becoming organic matter. So the more plants you have photosynthesizing and providing a diverse exudate blend to your soil, the more diverse soil microbials you have that are living and dying. And that's how you really accelerate building soil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And I think you mentioned some of the technology that you're seeing now. I believe it was with one of your neighbors' farms where they had the weather machine stuff there, where they could predict soil quality and fertilization needs and things like that. And I'm interested in that because I think my first point of just even recognizing the level of technology that was moving into the ag side of things was when I was teaching. I had a student who his family had it was a multi-generational dairy farm, and they were at kind of a bit of a crossroad where his dad was either going to sell the farm or they were going to overhaul the tech side of it, because they got selected for this beta testing for this milking machine, essentially, where the cows they would just walk in it when they were ready to milk, and then it would do all these tests on it to test the health of the cow, the health of their udder, whether they were producing the right amount of milk and everything. So it would it would select and notify, and he'd actually get text messages during the school day where it'd be such and such cow went through and has an aggravated udder, so you should pull it out and treat that. And it was just super interesting how much that did for both the health of their dairy cows and their ability just to be milked when they wanted to be milked. And one thing that they didn't realize that they discovered was their cows preferred to be milked 3 times a day, and one of them was at 1:30 in the morning was when a lot of them would go in there. And they're yeah, we just wouldn't be milking them at 1:30 in the morning if we were doing this the old fashioned way. So but it was an interesting story because this kid was 16 years old at the time, and his dad asked him, he's look, I need you to decide if you're going to inherit the farm, because if you don't want to, we're going to sell it. If you do, we're going to upgrade all this new tech. So as a 16-year-old, he had to decide if he wanted to be a farmer for the rest of his life or not. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting learning experience for both me and that student to kind of see all that stuff. But
yeah I just add to that, those sorts of investments, those are things like your earlier question about transitioning to regenerative agriculture. That's another reason why it is a process and it does take time, is replacing equipment, investing in new equipment. Those are things you can't just do all in one year. If you just built a new barn, if you just bought a new seeder, to replace it just right now to make that transition isn't necessarily going to be practical. So that's why a transition to regenerative practices might also have to fit within your equipment succession plan and investment plan over time. Because in agriculture, equipment and technology, they're so expensive. But you're right too, there's also new equipment, new practices that do help with that transition. I love what you brought up about animal health in dairy animals, because they also have monitors you can put on cattle that monitor their movement. So it's kind of like a Garmin watch. And if a cow is walking less or moving less or not going to water as frequently as normal, you'll get a text message that, maybe she's sick, maybe something's wrong, go check her. So that's another just funny running parallel in terms of, if your mileage was down in a week, you might
Yeah.
not be feeling well
I
either.
had the flu, so I lost some mileage.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah, it is interesting though. I mean, it's you get that level of data collection and then it gets automated at the point where like you're not even running those numbers. It's just self-calculating like, well, we know this cow travels X number of meters or miles or whatever the metric it's going to be. And yeah, when they hit like a certain threshold below, it's like there's something probably not quite working right. And yeah, that's super interesting stuff. Is there any other new tech that is coming out that you're like really excited about within either just general ag tech or specific to regenerative agriculture?
I mean, for me on my farm, I am a very low tech farm, both from a cost perspective, but also that regenerative paradigm of I am simplifying things and I am going back. Some people would say I'm going backwards, but I'm simplifying things and removing a lot of equipment really, um, to work more with nature and her systems as opposed to technological systems. Having said that, for measurement and validation, there's great innovation in soil tests, great innovation in monitoring carbon levels that are fascinating and hopefully very functional in the future for carbon policy and agriculture policy. So those sorts of things get me excited. But in terms of technology on my farm for the actual farming, it's very little.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose to a degree that's got to be a little liberating knowing that like you're relying on a well-established kind of cycle of like patterns that you're going to expect versus some machine breaking down where like, what are you going to do about that? Even if you know how to fix it, that's like lost time and energy to try to put into it. And then most likely you have to have someone come in and do that. But yeah, it makes sense. I think if you have that, if you're able to do more with less, you may as well, because you have less things to consider when it's problem solving time.
Exactly. That's largely the goal of my farm is low cost production, and relying on nature and the 5 principles of soil health as those are the technologies that are improving my farm. And they're not fancy and sexy or new buzzwords or new technology, but they're really working for me.
Awesome. I do want to chat a bit about some of your running and I guess you could call it experimentation, perhaps, where or challenges maybe where I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast you did, and correct me if I've misinterpreted this, but I believe you trained for and raced an ultramarathon with eating just food off of your farm, both during the training and then also during the event itself.
Yeah, I've done a bit of both. The race that I did, it was a marathon. It was Edmonton Marathon a few weeks ago. And the goal for that one was to fuel myself just with food that I had grown. So I dried some beef and beef tallow. I made pemmican bars, wrapped them in tinfoil and ran the whole race like that. I salted them heavily for electrolytes and that was pretty cool. I mean, I've done a few of those sorts of challenges, even with diet and nutrition for running. Um, I've been more, I think I've been more interested in nutrition that's value based than a certain type of diet. Like I eat pretty paleo or keto based, but most of my nutrition principles are, um, eating self-sufficient, eating from my farm, buying food only from other regenerative farmers. So I've gone through periods of that where those are the nutrition practices that I follow. I did one race season or one summer where all I ate was food from my farm, eggs and meat and a little bit of garden produce. Last year, I mostly ran the season on with my diet was only food that was grown in Canada. And so I think that just comes from my farming passion is running really is more about the value it provides to me and building myself, mental toughness, discipline, confidence. Those are all the things that that's why I run and why I keep going. And so on the nutrition side, I've tried to tie in my values of how I want to see food produced and how I want to fuel myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me, used to go to this grocery store before where I used to live, where they have like these labels that they put on specific products that was I believe it was like it was grown within 100 miles of the store location or something like that. And I thought that was kind of interesting where like if someone wanted to be like a localvore or whatever you want to call it, they could just kind of look for that label and be like, okay, well, this one didn't travel far to get here, so to speak. And you sort of kind of self-imposed that to an even larger degree. I mean, essentially for a while you were doing it on a square mile, I guess.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
is a
No,
really cool story.
I did. It was 75 days. It was a round of the 75 hard challenge I did with a bunch of my farmer friends. And my diet rule was just food grown from my farm. And so for that summer, I raced all my races just beef. And I actually prepared for that pretty well. I got some chickens for layers. I raised 2 pigs, 2 lambs, 2 goats, and just filled my freezer and yeah, did a whole summer and race season just on food that I'd grown. So that was a pretty cool. Um, yeah, it just brought a lot of value. It's probably not the best way to train. It's probably, I don't know, did I bonk harder on some races than I should have, or could I have gone? I'm sure there's diet and training ways that I could fine tune, but the value, or not the value, but the reasons that I run and the reasons that I love regenerative agriculture, those are the things that keep me going. So if I focus on those things, that's when I find I can keep going on those long runs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you find yourself training for a running race, it's like we get hung up with like, who wins the race and who's the fastest and all that stuff. And I mean, that's fun and entertaining and interesting stuff and motivating stuff. But really, like for most people, it's about finding whatever their why is and what's getting
Mm-hmm.
them to do it in the first place. So, I think it's just that much more fun to follow when someone has a unique why like that, where it's clear. It's like you didn't just do that because you thought that's what you were supposed to do. It was clear that's something you do when you like are very much invested in that passion. And you kind of just displayed what your beliefs were with that kind of thing to a degree. And it's just cool. I think it's a fun way to add some excitement to an otherwise just kind of very kind of metric driven sport, I guess.
Totally. And I mean, I'm not a fast runner. I'm not winning. I'm not in the fast group. I'm out there for health, for fun, for community, for challenging myself. My whys are not often about pace, even though I'd love to get faster. But yeah, the tying the two together, regenerative agriculture, food from my farm, and endurance running, that's when it gets really fun. And I'm going to keep going with that sort of mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. I love it. I have one last question. It's a little bit of a pivot, but I'm always interested with this because I mean, you're up in Canada, you get real winter up there. So, what is it like with the seasons in terms of how the cows are sort of going about their day when you're in the dead of winter? How is that different? Do you have to have enough crop growth during the year that you can silo food for them for the winter months, or is there a different way to do that on a regenerative agricultural setup?
Yeah, good question, because it gets cold up here. It changes the farm and it changes my training and my running. So winter is a challenge in Canada. But yeah, in the winter, the cows are grazing as long as I possibly can. So it depends on temperature and snowfall, but I want to keep them out grazing as long as possible. I do keep stockpiled fields of grass close to the yard specifically for that. And there's a few specifically that have a lot of tree cover and protection so that they can keep grazing into winter. And then when snow gets too deep, they'll be bale grazing through the winter. So that is harvested forage that gets baled up and it gets left in the field. And the cows graze that as stockpiled forage throughout kind of January to early April or so. And again, that's been a huge benefit for both labor and also building soil, is that bale grazing, because that moves a lot of nutrients back onto the soil and cows are spreading it around through the winter. And also, instead of me going out and feeding cows daily, it's the cows who are harvesting it themselves and going and getting it themselves as well. So they do get shelter, they do get extra feed. Temperature is something to monitor closely. They do need extra energy. You know, again, similar to a runner, when you're going to go run a marathon, you dial in your nutrition and make sure you're well fueled. And it's the same when it gets to be minus 25 or minus 30. Those cows need more to keep going and to keep, like, a fuel for cows is really how they heat themselves. They have four stomachs producing a lot of heat. So that's, if you keep that cycling through them, they can stay really quite warm.
Interesting. Yeah. And is there any positive aspect of having them still out there wandering around the field, even in the winter when there's snow cover? Because I know, like, one of the reasons you want cows out on pasture is because they are walking through, going to the bathroom on the field, hooves are stomping all that stuff down and stuff. Is that still necessary in the winter with snow there? Or is that just kind of just sort of, I don't want to say turned off, but I guess turned off in the winter and not as important?
No, it's totally important. Like, yeah, they're moving around. They're the manure is being spread by them around the field as opposed to having to spread it with a tractor in the spring if they were in the yard. But also, as a cow-calf producer, those cows are going to be calving in May. So I specifically put the feed, it's probably about 2 miles from the yard, and they have to walk in 2 miles every day for water and back out to feed. And that's to make pregnancy and gestation and when they have birth, they're fit, strong animals, and calving problems are way, way less when they're moving throughout the winter. So it's definitely a benefit to keep them out on the land and keep them moving. You know, we run for our health, and I make them move for theirs too.
Got a full fitness program
If
going
your
on
farmer
in
is a runner, then you gotta walk cows.
That is cool. Well, I think there's a lot of reason for a cow to want to end up on your farm by the sounds of it. So this has been awesome, Stuart. Thanks so much for taking some time to chat. If there's anything else you want to dive into, we certainly can. If not, I'd love to share with our listeners where they can find you, if you have a website, social media channels and things like that, or I didn't ask you this, but I don't know like if you sell direct to consumer or not, or if you have anything like that, feel free to share those as well.
You bet. I do some direct to consumer sales, but I am pretty remote on my farm, so that's not a key driver for me. I am on Instagram as Stuart Chutter, and I like to share a lot of both running and regenerative agriculture benefits on there. And then lastly, I'd just say, you know, farmers have so many values about the environment, and I suspect most of them are on some sort of regenerative journey. So wherever you live or whatever you're consuming, I encourage you to go find a farmer with practices and values that you believe in and that resonate with you, and support them, because they are running businesses and that's how they make their living. And to make those investments in the soil, they need the support from consumers to keep doing that.
Awesome. Well, thanks a bunch, Stuart, for coming on the show, and I'm stoked you reached out and glad we were able to make this happen.
You bet. Thank you so much.
Take care. Have a great rest of the day.
You too.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. Hey folks, thanks for checking out this episode of the podcast. For those of you who are regular listeners, you'll likely know I'm also a professional endurance athlete and coach. If you're looking for a little extra help with your training and programming, I do offer individualized coaching options where you can work directly with me one-on-one. I'll personalize your plan and even scale it up to email collaboration and regular consultations. You can also access either of those on their own if you just want to contact me as you're navigating your fitness journey. I also have some ready-made plans. The ready-made plans follow my coaching philosophy, and they scale from 5 kilometers all the way up to 100 miles and come in 3 different levels. So whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced, I've got something for you there. And most recently, I also just added a strength athlete's guide to endurance program, which will help someone who is primarily a strength athlete who wants to either do an endurance event for the fun of it, bolster up their cardiovascular fitness, or just try something out, try something new. So those programs are built to be able to supplement a strength program, so you won't have to give up on your gains in the gym while you're going after some running or endurance related fitness goals. You can find all those things on my website at zachbitter.com. Thanks for checking out this episode.